So what we want to focus on tonight is particularly what the non-native population, what we can do to help create a climate where these voices that have been underrepresented can be better heard. So what might that role be? Some of the elements for us might be a simple attitude of listening or being open, allowing for multiple evolving voices. You know, it's very interesting. We often talk about our kind of shared history as a unifying process. You know, we often talk about a unifying history, but in this case, we're talking about a history that is composed of voices with different perspectives. So, Native person said that that they view Thanksgiving differently than I would necessarily. It kind of struck home. So one of the things is creating an attitude that accommodates for listening, and seeing the Native community as a mosaic of tribal and individual people, right? It's not a monolithic community with one big common view. And one of the interesting things, I think, is to look at the narratives that have been present about Native people and looking at distinguishing fact, fiction, and frankly, folklore among these very popular narratives. And I think we have some pretty interesting examples about that. And Melodye's going to talk about Melodye being involved in land use in Rhinebeck and elsewhere for 18 years, going to talk about the role of being the eyes and the ears for the Native community to alert them to resources that may wish to be presented. So I talk first about a multiple perspective, and I often refer people to this woman's talk. She has, I see now, approaching 10 million views from 12 years ago, and she talks about what it's like to grow up Black in Africa, but be exposed to largely white stories and role models. And it's a TED talk. Sometimes ourselves, we might have a different perspective. And I like to use this example of this gentleman. Artist Robert Weir had a very optimistic view of the arrival of Henry Hudson. Robert Weir painted this in 1835, and he shows, of course, a heroic Henry Hudson and Native people who are very robust, and a native land that is very green and verdant. Because he was very optimistic at the time. He was about to take a position as the head teacher of painting at West Point, and the Seminole Indian Wars were beginning to rage. And the Native people, someone at West Point, were beginning to look more like an enemy, something different. And Robert Weir redid this exact same painting in 3 years later with this perspective. And you can see that it's a dramatic difference, right? So now Native people are, instead of robust and healthy, they're kind of dark and foreboding, and even the surrounding land is no longer green and verdant, kind of barren and in need of husbandry and keeping up from Europeans. So when we talk about the need to accommodate different perspectives from different communities, I always like to remind ourselves that we can have different perspectives from one individual. Circumstances can change, their feelings about the subject that they're painting can change, and they change the depiction accordingly. That's Hudson's Arrival at Verplancks Point by Robert Weir. One of the things we consciously did 6 to 9 months ago, Melodye Moore, Will Tatum, and I are co-editing the upcoming yearbook, and we are hoping to publish lesser told stories that could include stories of Native people. So we've been making a conscientious effort to understand the perspectives of different groups. And I wanted to recommend to everyone, Val LaRobardier has done a very interesting moderated panel that she hosted through the Dutchess County Genealogical Society. And she did that only just a couple of months ago, and it's on our website, DCHSNY/erased, because she talks about erased history. And I recommend that. Another great advisor to us has been Bard Professor Christiane Crouch. She's the author of an article called The Black City, and I was going to I can share that article. I thought I could just post it, but I think for copyright reasons I can't. But she had recommended that article to us, and it's a very interesting perspective, kind of overview that I can share. And she's working with us to look at how Native people are depicted in some of the WPA murals in the Rhinebeck Post Office, in Poughkeepsie, and in Hyde Park. And the other people we've been speaking to, the Muncie Stockbridge, Heather Bruegel is the Director of Cultural Affairs there, and Bonnie Hartley is the Historic Preservation Manager. And they have begun conversations with us about how to look and examine these stories of Native people here locally. The Stockbridge Muncie Band of Mohican Indians, when we spoke to Bonnie Hartley, she directed us to look at this map that is a particular area of interest for them. And you can see that Dutchess County is very much in the middle of that. Bonnie Hartley in particular is involved in the repatriation of human remains and cultural artifacts to the Stockbridge Muncie people. And this is the area of concern for them. Through the Open Space Institute, which bought an island further north, they've returned it to Stockbridge Muncie as part of an effort to return important historic lands to the people themselves.
My name is Charlie Burgess, and I work for the Open Space Institute.
My name is Bonnie Hartley. My name in our language is Tehequindohat, which means she has her arms around the people. And I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Manager for Stockbridge Muncie Community.
We're here today to celebrate the return of the Papscany Island Preserve to the Mohican Nation.
The Mohican people have a long-standing history at Papscany Island spanning known to be at least 12,000 years or so based on the archaeology.
The place is more than just a sort of domicile. It's believed to be one of the longest continuously cultivated places in the United States. It's also a place of ritual and sort of sacred importance.
It's a place that we continue to return to, even though our community is displaced now to Wisconsin. It's a place that is still kind of a cultural touchstone in a way that we can come back to, and we can, directly communicate and, draw strength with our ancestors here.
In the 90s, the development pressure became really intense. Big oil tankers and petroleum processing plants, that sort of thing. So the Open Space Institute swooped in the 1990s and purchased the property and preserved it as a public nature preserve. There are hard truths that we need to face about dispossession and injustice. The Open Space Institute is honored to have the opportunity to restore this land to the Stockbridge Muncie Mohican community.
So we're just really grateful to have this moment in time to work with Open Space Institute to receive this portion of our homelands back. And so much of our work is focused on trying to protect individual sites, important burial sites and village sites, cultural sites, so that we protect them from being destroyed, and include visitors here in a respectful way, and hopefully inspire more people to learn about our history. But I think it's a different type of experience to have, to really have it back and have it to be in our management again, like that we're actually stewarding it the way that we did for so many generations.
Stockbridge Museum has been involved in an exhibition in Stockbridge, which is interesting. That is both a physical exhibition like this, and it involves kind of a very common kind of street tour that you take yourself on. And I would think that the kind of exhibitions that they're doing in Stockbridge are the kind of exhibitions we could work on in partnership with them on, where they're helping us understand exactly what's happened locally from their perspective and telling it from their perspective. So I hope we're going to do more work with them. I wanted to share just some personal experience in terms of being open and listening to what is around us that has some Native influence. I had the opportunity in the city to look at the original paths of Native American footpaths that are visible today. This particular junction is Gansevoort Street and Greenwich Avenue. And I was working with a group there to really come to understand how these paths emerged into ox cart, and horse and carriage, and then ultimately roads. And one of the interesting things we discovered is that this ancient footpath, because it would make sense that the colonial settlers would kind of build on those roads, that the street leading to the river happened to be exactly aligned to the spring equinox. And I love this example because so many people cross that street at that junction. It's kind of an odd angle, and aren't aware that the reason it is this angle is that it's a Native American footpath, one of which is aligned to the vernal equinox. And I mention it as an example of being open-minded and listening, because I think there are things around us and just beneath our feet, especially in Dutchess County. Henry Noble McCracken wrote one of the more famous books about Dutchess County history, and he opens it, wrote it in the 1950s, talking about, kind of romantic terms, for 100 years, the Dutchess plowboy at the turn of his furrow would stoop to pick out a small, three-centered piece of hard stone that seemed different from the rounded field of gravel. He'd observed its sharp point, its chipped edges, and its barbed stem. And McCracken goes on, he was the president of Vassar College. He goes on to talk about how there are an enormous number of arrowheads and other tools from Native people in Dutchess County, so many so that farmers literally find them plowing their fields. And I knew from personal experience that that was true. When we moved to Dutchess County 20 years ago, we bought land that's a little hill. Turns out it was called Indian Hill, surrounded by on three sides by a stream. And the neighbor brought me the photographs on the left. The neighbor brought me an arrowhead that his grandfather found in the 1940s, just in the way that McCracken described it. And this arrowhead is about 3,000 years old. So we know that where we live, called by locals Indian Hill because of the number of artifacts that were found there by farmers, that these kinds of evidence of the presence of this large civilization is actually right all around us. So these are my points about listening and being open. We don't have to listen or be open from too far a distance to encounter the evidence of these people. Lake Warakamak, which is still named that, is on the oldest maps and used as a point of reference. And it's another example, I think, of these are the Little Nine Partners maps from 1744 and an earlier map from the late 17th century, all showing that a lot of the earliest settlers were working with Native people and using Native landmarks as means to subdivide, if you will, the land and settle. But this is like Warakamak is in the north of Dutchess County. So my point there is keep your eyes open. Its evidence is all around us if we're open to it. I wanted to talk a little bit about real people and legendary people. Legendary people may or may not be fact-based. And I'll give you a couple examples, starting with real people who we know do exist. In terms of kind of well-known groups, if you will, and tribes, I was advised by April Bezow at Vassar College some time ago to look at this particular map developed by a native person. I think it's Karapala tribal nation. And she said that this is unusual because it's a map developed by a native person, and that this is their view of some of the tribes and groups that were settled in our area before 1609 and before contact. So I put it there just kind of in contrast to this broader map, which I think is pretty highly regarded for the most part. It was developed by the Smithsonian Institution in the 1970s. And the point it makes seems to be holding up, which is that the Mohican were a large civilization that was very much to the north. Southernmost point was the Roloff-Jansen Kill, around which Columbia County is formed, and that the Lenape or the Wappinger, part of the Delaware, great civilization to the south, and their northernmost reach was what we call the Wappinger Creek. And so it does seem like Dutchess County was this transitional border area between the Mohican and the Wappinger. And this map kind of depicts that. There's been some discussion whether the what is called Sapascot, which is not a native name, but an English name, whether the Sapascot and Rhinebeck were actually more tied to the western part across the river, and that they were kind of this dividing line between Wappinger and Mohican. But somewhere in this range, you had kind of the northern and southern border of these two communities. I was going to talk about Sapascot and Rhinebeck, but I'll just leave it to say that the village is believed to have been around a significantly sized lake that is there. And what is curious is the idea that it might have been kind of the border between these two great larger groups. Rhinebeck. One of the most peculiar things in Rhinebeck perhaps was depicted by Olin Dowse in 1686. There is this depiction of what's called a petroglyph. And there are photos that were documented, especially in the 1930s by Margaret DeMott Brown, that were published in our yearbook. I think this is one of them. So this is a combination of a rubbing and then a photograph of the rubbing. This is at Wildercliff in Rhinebeck. And there are even more contemporary photographs of it. A very recent, newly published book, so this is a more contemporary photograph, talks about the Wilderstein petroglyph and its potential meaning. It may have had something to do with the marking of land and the subdivision and bordering of lands. The other group that comes to mind, Chicomico, is in Pine Plains, and this monument remains from the 19th century. The Chicomico were famous because they were in 1740 approached by Christian missionaries and seemed receptive to conversion to Christianity. And the experiment didn't last very long, in that there was some concern with even state officials and the governor that a group of native people who become Christian and too close, in a sense, to society and too integrated to society could be a threat. And there were forces working against them that really pushed this group of people completely out and away from the area as a community. And this monument this monument remains there. It's kind of a well-known painting. It was done in the 19th century, thinking about the idea of a native person. They're looking at a mask from his pre-Christian days and holding a cross in his left hand. And this is the kind of idealized romantic notion that Christian missionaries had at the time when they were wishing to convert native people to Christianity. Daniel Nimham, we know, was famous as a leader in southern Dutchess for making very persuasive legal claims to land, and claims that involved his going to England. A very sophisticated leader and arguer of indigenous land rights that ultimately he did not prevail, but it's kind of one of our better known stories of actual individuals who were leaders in the community. One of the most surprising people we were introduced to through Christiane Crouch was not so much Brant, this Canadian indigenous leader who is pretty well known and associated with the Loyalists, but she introduced us to a story of an enslaved individual of Brant, and it is a woman named Sophia Pulley. And there was published in 1856 some narratives of former slaves in the US who were in Canada. So remember, it's 1856, it's just before the Civil War. 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Law. So you have more and more either enslaved individuals or former enslaved in Canada. And this is a first-hand recording from Sophia Pulley, who explains that she was an enslaved individual in Fishkill in southern Dutchess. And she goes on to explain and testify, this is Sophia Pulley's words, that her father's name was Oliver Berthen and her mother Dinah. She writes in 1856 that she says, I'm more than 90 years old. I was stolen from my parents when I was 7 and brought to Canada. When she was 7, it was just before the Revolutionary War. When I was 7, I was stolen and brought to Canada. That was long before the Revolution. There were hardly any white people in Canada. And she goes on to talk about her master's sons-in-law in Fishkill, who are people that we've investigated, Daniel Outwiders and Simon Knox. They're individuals who were Quakers, they were Loyalists, and they were enslavers. That these two individuals, she's now saying, they came into my garden where my sister and I were playing among currant bushes, tied their handkerchiefs over our mouths and carried us to a vessel, put us in hold and sold upriver. And then I will we'll make this story available because it's actually in a book that's available online, and I hadn't been aware of it, but she talks about what it was like to be an enslaved individual with Brant. She was not treated well by his wife, but she talks about the extraordinary things she did, hunting deer. She's a very active and ambitious woman, and it's so rare to have a first-hand account. So she is Black, she's of African heritage, and in this instance, we have the unusual situation where the enslaver here is a native person himself. This is what the story looks like. The book is called The Refugee of the Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada, and the story is of Sophia Pulley. I came across this newspaper article only recently. It's a copy of a paper we have from November of 1779. So the Revolutionary War is raging. The New York Journal is published in Poughkeepsie because remember, New York City is a loyalist in this period during the war. Poughkeepsie is not. And there's a runaway ad. Runaway on Saturday the 13th from the subscriber, from James Morehouse in Dover, Pauling's Precinct in the state of New York, a thick-set Indian boy, long black hair, about 13 years of age. He had on a claret-colored jacket, a pair of short woolen trousers. Whoever takes up and secures the said boy, giving notice so that the subscriber gets him again, shall have $50 reward. And I shared this with Jim Merrill, the professor at Vassar, who studies this a great deal. And he did confirm that there were occasions where Native people were enslaved. So we've just looked at an instance where a Native person was enslaved and a Native person was an enslaver. And I guess this goes back to my earlier point about being open and listening, because I think a lot of the assumptions that we have or stories that we're told are not necessarily, it's not that cut and dry, if you will. And then came across this recently, another Poughkeepsie paper called The Independence in 1833, run away from the subscriber, Samuel Bishop, an indentured apprentice. He's an Indian boy with straight brown hair. And then he goes on to talk about his white fur hat and so on, and was 17 years old. So here's an instance of William Pugsley in Northeast, in an instance where he has a Native person as an indentured servant. So you can actually find a lot of different relationships. I've been talking about these people as real people because we know Daniel Ninham lived and existed and Brant did. And then I talk about legendary people because it's a little less clear whether they actually lived, or this is my question about whether we're looking at fact, fiction, or folklore in particular instances. And I want to show you some examples what I'm talking about. I found it interesting that the Pomeroy Foundation now has a folklore sign brought to you by the people who have the very rigorous standards around historical markers. I think it's great that they have kind of elevated the status of folklore in this way. Always interested in folklore because sometimes there's a grain of truth, but folklore is about those stories that we seem to need to create for some reason. So I find it very interesting to look at folklore and think about why these stories emerged in the way they did. So 3 cheers for Pomeroy for doing that. All in an effort to pick apart the difference between fact, fiction, and folklore. But this was referred to us as a book by Christiane Crouch at Bard. This book is by Gene O'Brien, and it's called Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England. And it's a fascinating read and well worth considering doing for the Valley and Dutchess County. The point being that when you look at the narratives of histories that have been written largely by white people, you find language like the first settlers and the Europeans are always doing the first things, right? And the Native people are always in the position of being the last. And I thought, once I started thinking about it in those terms, and I think any of the Native people we talked about thought that the biggest misperception that they want corrected is that they're gone. And they want us to understand that they're here. And I thought, well, why do we think they're gone? And I couldn't help but think of some of the most popular narratives, right? What are some of the most intense and enduring narratives about Native people? 1826, The Last of the Mohicans, is written by James Fenimore Cooper. And if you look since then and consider not just how enduring it is, but how many different media it survives in, silent movies, sound movies, Daniel Day-Lewis, it begs the question, why is there so much attention and narrative put on this idea of the Native people being gone? That the last of them was some time ago. And there's a very dramatic moment in the silent movie version where the white person shakes hands with the last of the Mohicans and he exits right and is off. So why is that narrative of what the O'Brien author calls the lasting. Why was that so important? And are there examples of it around us? I apologize for keep going to my hometown, but I've studied at the locus the most. This is in the town of Milan, and it gets a fresh coat of paint every couple of years. It says Indian Burial Ground Chief Crow and other Mohican Chikomicos of Moravian faith buried here. Last burial, about 1850. State education, 1935. So one of the things that's comfortable about the sign, or would have been in 1935, is that these would have been the Christianized native people that I was talking about at Chicomico, although that place collapsed only within a couple of years of 1740. So it's quite a stretch already on face value to consider the fact that this Chief Crow was buried there in 1850 when the group was essentially pushed out of the state in the early 1740s. And if you poke into it a little bit longer, you find that when the sign was applied for by a Mrs. Harrison, she applied for over 100 of these blue and yellow signs that dot Columbia and Dutchess County. The little evidence she gave that this is true was that old men of this section tell of their grandparents seeing these daily in their burials in this place. So we know that Mrs. Harrison has not offered any solid evidence. She has just offered hearsay, basically. Well, if you read the newspapers right around the time that Mrs. Harrison sent in that application, she actually hosted a little tea party where this story was told. So if you read the local paper in 1935, it says Indian occupation of Gallatin was recalled. Interesting choice of words. And it goes on to explain that there was a man is testifying at this tea party with Mrs. Harrison that there was a little girl on her way to school who passed a chief's wigwam each day. And this is meant to be in Gallatin, right on the border of northern Dutchess County. And this little girl was on her way to school, and one day the chief gave a big war whoop and scared the little girl, and she was frightened. The chief told her, and allow me to quote, "Me no hurt little white gal." Then he grabbed her in his arms and took her to school, and all was well. So, and then the story goes on to say, the person testifying says, she grew up, married, raised a family, and I am her grandson. So this is the grandson testifying that indeed there was a Chief Crow. So, I mean, this, how could you argue with that or doubt that? But it turns out that in 1935, and this was first revealed in the 1970s by Bobby Thompson, who is still working on history locally. Bobby Thompson in the 1970s first exposed the idea that there was not really a Chief Crow there, and that it was potentially a Black African-American burial ground. And indeed, the more research we've done more locally is to discover that Bobby Thompson's hunch in the 1970s was absolutely correct. And we've found now a number of newspaper articles that document the burial of Blacks in that cemetery, referring to it as a colored cemetery. And the second owner, Black owner, was a woman named Nancy Bradford. It became known and referred to as Nancy Crow Lot. Nancy Crow, a reference to her Blackness, no doubt. And it is for this reason we think that it became known as Crow Lot, as the Black burial ground. And then in 1935, it was reimagined, is the word we use today, I guess. It was reimagined as not a Black burial ground of former slaves, but instead a burial ground of an Indian chief. My concern about not correcting these things visibly is that well-known historians like Shirley Dunn, who wrote The Mohican World, took a photograph and put a caption on saying that this was so. And I actually spoke to her because I was so concerned that I was misunderstanding something. Here she's telling the stories of Mohicans. Here she's referencing Chief Crow. And I said, am I misunderstanding? Is there really a Chief Crow? She admitted that there was not really any evidence and that she was merely taking a photograph of the roadside marker. And this is why I feel it's important to add context. And Chief Crow maybe there was a Chief Crow, we don't know. And or maybe he was part fact, part folklore, we don't know. But we do know that Blacks were buried there, including a Revolutionary War veteran who served this country and former enslaved individuals. And we're working to get some recognition of that so that passersby, like Shirley Dunn, don't keep repeating the error. She also took a photograph of the site of, this is on just over the border in Columbia County, the site of the Manessa home. I have a better picture of that. Manessa, Prince Quack Manessa. So the sign says that this is the site of Manessa home, Prince Quack Manessa of the Mohican Chicomico clan. Remember, all these 100 signs were done by the same woman, Mrs. Harrison. And she obviously liked the Chicomico clan. But here we are now in Columbia County, we have the last known Indian there. And the interesting thing is, when you start to peel back the layers of this, you find that you begin to see stories of intermarriage. And I think this is where it's probably beyond our ability to ever really know. Isaac Hunting wrote a famous history of Pine Plains, but he is the one who wrote about Prince Quack Manessa being an Indian man. This is the word and history of Isaac Hunting in his history of Pine Plains from around 1900. And he really dove into this Manessa story. And this was a time when Indian medicine, of course, was very popular. In a way, this is how the narratives have been boiled down and simplified. So Prince Quack Manessa actually turns out to have been a person who was called Prince Minisee. And Prince Minisee, although he's known as a native here, is well known, he moved to Michigan, is well known as the head of a Black farming family in Michigan. And I've spoken to descendants of Prince Minisee in Michigan. I've asked them if they were aware that in New York he's known more as a Native person. They said they hadn't heard that, they didn't know that. And it's entirely possible, if not even likely, that there were intermarriages. So we don't know, again, how he was identifying, never mind what his exact genetic makeup was, but also, how he himself identified. So like any good history, you just start to get better and more questions and better questions rather than answers. But Prince Quack Minisee, who was Prince Minisee, is famous for being a Native person in New York and a Black person in Michigan. The depiction of 1609, this painting by Edward Moran really became in 1892, a kind of touchstone, often repeated symbolic or iconic painting. And you find it in postcards, you find it in the Rhinebeck post office murals by Olin Dowes. He did the scene in Hyde Park, right? It's a very powerful moment of first contact when Henry Hudson arrives and Native people are looking at him and their world is about to change. So this moment really becomes an iconic moment that is reflected in all these different ways. So we think about all those stories. We have stories about Indian chiefs and medicine men. We have stories that tend to talk about the last of Native people and their goneness. And yet they come back in the most interesting and telling ways, if you will. So I found it interesting that the Boston Tea Party, all these individuals dressed as Native people, before they wreaked havoc on the tea boxes. And I was prompted to think about that when I was reading a story about anti-renters just over into the Columbia County border. These anti-renters were wreaking havoc and rioting against the sheriff and against the police. They dressed as Native people. And so it's kind of interesting that whites started to appropriate this kind of costume when they were trying to express some sort of real rage and danger. On the softer side, though, there were clubs like this one in Poughkeepsie. There was a Red Men's Club. There were clubs where white people really took on the name of Native people. And in this particular instance, it looks like dress and not quite blackface, but they're affecting the color of their skin to kind of reflect that community. This is, so you remember that the stories are about Native people being gone, and yet they come back in these different ways. And Craig Marshall had shared this photograph with me of the Schultzville campfire girls. And again, it's when you bear in mind that the overriding narrative has been about the disappearance of these people, it's interesting that Native people come back in this kind of imitated form in these different ways. So Melodye will talk about protecting cultural resources, but I just want to recap that, you know, because I'm in no way an expert on this, but I do feel I hear Native voices and Native people having things to say. And I do feel like we can be better listeners, and that there are things right around us, below our feet, how our streets are organized. And that we can be more aware of kind of the cliches of that these people are not gone. And we can be aware of being caught up in those narratives and be more aware of that context and guidance. And then with that, I'll ask Melodye to talk about the specific action we can take to protect cultural resources.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I want to thank everybody for inviting us to be with you tonight. And as you can tell, we feel this is a very important topic. And I want to thank Bill for giving us such a wonderful framework for this story. As I'm sure you can see, when Bill and I are asked to present or to write stories, we look to the documentable past. We're used to looking at photographs, letters, objects, diaries, primary sources that contain the facts necessary to weave together a truthful narrative. But I think, as you've seen this evening, there is always the question of whose truth is this? We've always known, but certainly events in recent times have reinforced the fact that my truth is not necessarily your truth, and that the job of historians is to be continuously re-examining our interpretation of the past and holding it up to be scrutinized through the lens of new information. So the bottom line, as you have easily seen, is it's not easy to tell the story of Native Americans, much less the story of Native Americans in Dutchess County. Where do we as historians get our information about the Native Americans? I don't want to seem to be overly simplistic, but it seems to me that the basic difference between academic historians studying Native American history and Native American history told from the perspective of a Native American is the vehicle through which the history is told. While academic historians typically rely on the written narrative, Native cultures, not having that, often rely on oral tradition. So while work continues to find ways to better understand this history, my question to us is, what can we as stewards of the past do to help? My thought is that we must become more knowledgeable about and active proponents of the stewardship and preservation of the land, because that is where there is still evidence to help expand our knowledge. I'm talking about the role archaeology can play. I'm not, let me be very clear, promoting archaeology for the sake of archaeology, but instead making ourselves aware of how it can and should be used when no alternatives exist. I'd like to use the example of the Nook to illustrate what information can be recovered when archaeological work is properly conducted. The site is marked by this Pomeroy Foundation historic marker, and we introduced the Pomeroy Foundation earlier. According to the information on the Foundation's website, before the arrival of Europeans to New York State, there was a thriving Native American community in the area now known as the hamlet of Wassaic. The sign says archaeological evidence found by Ken Hoadley shows that the Weebatuck Creek site was used by Native Americans for a camp and powwows in the early 1800s. And this sign marks the location of what was believed to be the camp. I think Bill has a couple of slides of where this Pomeroy sign is and what we're talking about in Wassaic. They are down in the town of, in the Wassaic area. Presumably, this information is taken from Philip H. Smith's 1877 General History of Dutchess County from 1609 to 1876. If you note, looking at the book, that Smith chose to begin his history in 1609 at the point of contact. So even though Smith later in his book talks about Native Americans, he chooses to focus on this pivotal point that he considers to be important in 1609. And in the beginning of his book, when he refers to Aborigines, he talks about the disappearance of Native Americans. And you'll see this quote here. And he says, until not a vestige of pure Indian blood remains within the county limits. And this is another very clear example of the lasting that Bill spoke of earlier, as early as Smith's history in 1877. Still, he goes on to report that several Indian burial places in Amenia are spoken of in Pequot tribal tradition, one on the lands of Myron Benton, another near Amasa Coleman's, and still the burial places of families in the vicinity. But he goes on to say of special note was the place by the river called the Nook near South Amenia, where the Indians were accustomed to holding their noisy powwows. Note that in Smith's text, he uses the word noisy, where the Pomeroy sign has conveniently not included that word. Smith continues, there were a few wigwams near the outlet of Swift's Pond. Certainly this is all anecdotal, and there are no empirical facts to give us an understanding of Native American culture in this area. The story might have remained unchanged were it not for the Silo Ridge development that took place in Amenia. The Phase 1 Archaeological Survey, Silo Ridge Resort Community of 2006, was undertaken by the town of Amenia and the Louis Berger Group, and it revealed much more specific knowledge that has expanded our understanding of the site. The evidence led the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation to conclude that there were numerous pre-contact and historic archaeological sites within 3 miles of the project site. So what was once by Smith just described as a place for noisy powwows has now been identified as an important Dutchess County Native American site. While we might wish that development pressure would never result in the disturbance of important Native American sites, it's important that we be prepared to take action to preserve and protect as much as possible. I've had the pleasure, most of the time, of serving on the Rhinebeck Planning Board for 18 years, and I've reviewed many applications that include historic and cultural resources. Several years ago, recognizing that Rhinebeck could do a better job of protecting these resources, the town board created the Historic and Archaeological Preservation Advisory Group, better known as HAPAC. Their recommendations have helped the planning board to be more mindful of resource protection and to ask for archaeological surveys when warranted. So I ask all of us, what can we do to promote the protection of archaeological sites so that they can become the resource we need in understanding the Native American history and culture? We can, as we're trying to do tonight, promote public awareness and education. We can, when we hear about it, report looting and vandalism to local authorities. Ken Hoadley wasn't vandalizing the property when he was digging in the Wassaic area, but there are people that continue to do that in unauthorized positions. We can respect archaeological sites and leave artifacts in place. And we can document whatever stories have been passed down and map locations of possible Native American sites. I'd like to expand a bit on my last point, which is the collecting of stories and mapping possible Native American sites. And I think this is something that I like to put out as a challenge to organizations like yours who are interested in documenting and preserving the history of your community. So in 1920, the University of the State of New York published Arthur Caswell Parker's The Archaeological History of New York, Volume 2. The book covers the entire state on a county-by-county basis and summarizes what was known about Native American sites at the time. The next slide shows a map of Dutchess County that was published in this 1920 volume. And the list to the right of it shows sites scattered across the entire county. Everywhere from Pine Plains to Wappingers to Amenia to the town of Poughkeepsie, Beekman, presumably all points in between. What's very difficult to see here, if you look carefully at the left and throughout the map, you will see little red marks denoting the sites that had been identified, presumably by local historians that are listed to the right. Is it 100% accurate? Probably not, but it is certainly 100 years closer to the anecdotal stories passed down from generation to generation. It's a place to start, and I would challenge local historians and historical societies to take up the task of recording whatever they can glean from the written record and from the folklore about Native American sites. I would make sure that local planning boards and decision makers have this information so that when developers come to town or proposed building sites come close to these properties, appropriate attention is paid to making sure that care is taken to protect the site to the greatest extent possible. The next slide is from the New York State Archaeological Council, and I call that to your attention because in some cases, local planning boards, including Rhinebeck now, go so far as to require that a cultural resource investigation take place according to the standards for cultural resource investigations and the curation of archaeological collections. The product of such investigations, like the one at Silo Ridge, can be a report that enhances our understanding of the site. In summary, while this may not be my past, your past, it is our past as residents of Dutchess County, and non-native people can play an important role in protecting the resources that will help the story to continue to be revealed and understood. Thank you.